Good evening, everyone. Nice to see you all. Hi, my name is Martin Seeger. I'm co-director of the Grantham Institute. Welcome to this event, Imperial College. Those from outside the college are particularly welcome. Nice to see you. Before we start, I've got to say something about the fire alarms and the fire drill. We're not expecting a fire alarm tonight. We're not expecting a fire tonight. So if we hear the alarms, we have to evacuate. And the way to do that is that the people at the back of the auditorium follow the stairs where you came up and you go out those doors over there, and the people at the front, that's us, we go out the side doors and you follow the signs to outside in that way. The ones in the middle of those, you just have to make a judgment on which is best. Okay. Welcome to the event on nuclear energy tonight. The Grantham Institute, which I co-direct, it was established 10 years ago to be Imperial's hub for climate change and environment work. We count around 25 staff, 140 PhD students and master students, and 200 affiliated academics amongst our numbers, and we work towards our vision for a sustainable, resilient, zero-carbon society. Together with our partners, we're a reputable source of research, training and innovation to confront the climate crisis. Tonight's event is hosted in partnership with the Centre for Nuclear Engineering, CNE, at Imperial College London. CNE is a cross-faculty centre promoting and coordinating nuclear energy research across Imperial College. The centre's history spans back to just after the Second World War, and since then, their researchers have made important contributions to the development of nuclear energy in the UK and overseas. This event marks the launch of Grantham Institute's briefing paper, The Role of Nuclear Electricity in a Low-Carbon World. You still all have a copy of that? Take a look at it. Yours to take away. And on the panel tonight, I'm delighted to introduce to you Neil Hirst, Senior Policy Fellow for the Grantham Institute and the author of the briefing paper. Neil, just say hello. Okay. Ben Britton, Deputy Director of the Centre for Nuclear Engineering. Hi, Ben. Tom Burke, Chairman of V3G. Hi, Tom. And Malwina Gradecka, Senior Engineer for Low Carbon Energy Technologies at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. Malwina. And Paul Spence, Director of Strategy and Corporate Affairs at EDF Energy. Hi, Paul. Your chair tonight is going to be Elisa Gilbert. She's the Director of Policy and Translation at the Grantham Institute, and she's going to take you from here. So please join me in welcoming all of our panel and Elisa, and we'll see how this goes on. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Martin. Thank you all for coming along tonight. Some time ago, we were having some discussions like we do at the Grantham Institute about what we should focus on, our next priorities, and what would make an interesting paper and an interesting discussion to inform the direction that policymakers are going in. And we felt like it was very important as an institute that works particularly on trying to tackle climate change to think really carefully and work together with experts on what the role is for nuclear power, focusing particularly on the UK, but also thinking globally. What do we see as the role of nuclear power in a low-carbon future? So what we're going to do in the next hour or so is I'm going to ask each of the speakers to speak to a few questions. We can get a bit of a discussion going between the panelists here on the basis of those questions, and then we're going to open it out to you for questions and answers. So rest assured there'll be about half an hour at least at the end for you to ask questions. So when they pop up, just make sure you're noting them down and remembering them. So there should be plenty of time for discussion in the room. And we hope to get down to the nitty-gritty of some of the most interesting sticking points on this question. So without further ado, I'm going to ask the panelists to each speak for about 5 minutes on what role they see, if any, for nuclear power in the UK energy landscape in the future. And we're going to start with Neil, who, as Martin said, was the author of the paper.
Thank you, Lisa. Am I audible? Is this?
Press again.
How does it work? Or shall I use this? That sounded like something went on. Here we are. Is that? Oh, somebody's coming.
Yes.
It's okay now, is it? Can everyone hear this? Hear me now? Yes, wave at the back if you can hear it. Yes? Okay, great. Thank you very much. Nuclear power has the potential to continue as a significant and perhaps major supplier of reliable, low-carbon, baseload power for the UK well into the future. But there are major risks and uncertainties. The first and most important uncertainty is the construction performance of the industry. The difficulties and setbacks with the construction of recent nuclear power stations in the US and Europe, including the EPR design that we have now adopted for Hinkley Point C, together with the financial difficulties of the industry, obviously raise concerns. If the performance at Hinkley Point C is no better, and if the government is forced to step in to bail out this project, that would be a grave and perhaps fatal blow to the prospects of nuclear power in the UK. But I'm not expecting that. Hopefully, we will learn from experience. The fact that the first EPR, built in China, has now started delivering power may be an encouraging sign. The second, closely related uncertainty is finance. The profile of nuclear power, with heavy upfront costs, followed by an extended construction period, followed by a recovery period of 60 years or more, makes it difficult to finance in the private sector. And of course, this difficulty is exacerbated by construction worries. To get Hinkley Point away, the government had to guarantee a price of £95.50 per megawatt hour, well above the price of offshore wind in the latest auction of £57.50. And even at this price, finance was only forthcoming because the interest of the French and Chinese governments in promoting their nuclear industries, and indeed the finance director of EDF resigned. Probably price guarantees of this kind are not the most efficient way for the government to promote nuclear power. Certainly that was the conclusion of the National Audit Office in their recent report. They pointed out that the option of nuclear power appears much more attractive economically if new stations are regarded as public infrastructure and financed at closer to the government's own cost of borrowing. And now the government is looking at those alternatives. For Hitachi's project at Wilfer, the government is proposing itself to cover 2/3 of the finance through loans and guarantees. And in their recently published industry strategy for the nuclear sector, the government have said they will be reviewing the viability of a regulated asset-based model for future projects. I believe that the finance model the government eventually adopts will be critical for the future of nuclear power in this country. A regulated asset model means shifting many of the construction and performance risks onto taxpayers and consumers. Can this be justified? I think the answer to that question comes down to the question of need of nuclear power. In other words, how much low-carbon electricity the UK will need, and how much of that can come from other sources, especially renewables. There's little doubt that we're going to have to increase our low-carbon electricity supply as our climate commitments bite, and probably as we electrify heating and transport. The question of what proportion can come from renewables in the future is hotly debated. It depends on the potential for demand-side flexibility, including from electric vehicles, and the progress in reducing the costs of electricity storage technologies, including batteries. The Climate Change Committee, drawing on Imperial College research, concluded that there is strong evidence that system costs for renewables penetration of up to 50% are manageable, and emerging evidence that penetration of 60% intermittent renewables will be technically possible by 2030. However, they said there is a lack of evidence on the costs of higher penetrations of renewables. And another recent study by Imperial, based on an integrated whole system model, concluded that although in the short and medium term the focus can be on deployment of variable renewables, in the long term, to achieve a zero carbon emissions target by 2050, more than 40 gigawatts of firm low carbon generation technologies such as nuclear will be required. And very topically, the recent report of the National Infrastructure Commission is also interesting. They offered a scenario with 90% renewables in 2050, which they project could be competitive with a more nuclear-based scenario. On this basis, they recommended that the government should not agree to support more than one further nuclear power station beyond Hinkley Point C to 2025. Their argument is that this will be sufficient to allow the UK to pursue a high renewable mix, which they think is the most likely to be preferred option, but without closing off the option of the nuclear alternative. And finally, sorry, I'm giving rather a lot of these projections, the government's projection, not exactly government policy, the projection of the government economists is that we will have 14 gigawatts of nuclear capacity in 2035, contributing at that point about 30% of electricity generation. At the moment, nuclear contributes about 20% of our electricity. And their share for renewables in 2035 was 50%. We have 9 gigawatts of nuclear capacity in the UK today, 8 of which is contributed by the advanced gas-cooled reactors, which are due to close between 2025 and 2030. So if we don't renew that, there will be a big loss of low-carbon capacity. Hinkley Point is due online in 2025 with a capacity of 3.2 gigawatts. The government is in discussion about a proposed Hitachi station at Wilfer and a second EPR modelled on Hinkley Point. There are other proposals for Alderbury, Moorside and Bradwell. I believe that the case for nuclear power comes down to questions of risk and of timing. As I've said, we're going to need a lot more low-carbon nuclear power to meet our climate needs. There's a lot of support for meeting that almost entirely from renewables, but we do not yet know how feasible that will be. And we may still need a reliable source of low-carbon power such as nuclear. Nuclear power is a long-term proposition that we can't turn on and off in a short period. The National Infrastructure Commission recognized this when they argue for another order to maintain the UK's nuclear supply chain for the future. My personal inclination would go to slightly beyond what the Infrastructure Commission are saying, and to aim at least to replace the retiring 8 gigawatts of capacity by the early 2030. So that would probably mean 2 or perhaps 3 more nuclear orders, not necessarily immediately. In any case, I think it's clear that we need to keep our next steps in nuclear ordering closely under review as the evidence emerges of the performance of the nuclear industry on the one hand, and of the feasibility of high renewables, of the options for high renewables dependence on the other. Now, I'm just about through. In the time available, I've concentrated very much on the prospects for today's generation of nuclear plants. Another way to mitigate the problems of finance is to build smaller reactors that may be largely factory built And I think I very much welcome the fact that the government is running a competition for the UK's participation in various options for small and medium-sized reactors. And of course, there's also a lot of work going on around the world in the next generation of nuclear reactors that may be safer, more cost-efficient, perhaps more proliferation resistant. But those, realistically, are still 20 or 30 years away. Thank you for your attention.
Great. Okay, thanks, Neil. That was very thorough. So lots of those facts were additional. You won't find them in your paper, so it's still worth reading the paper. Thanks. Now we're going to turn it over to Tong from EPG.
We've got two.
Who's going to give us his perspective on the role of nuclear in the UK energy landscape.
Thank you. Good evening. Let me do something really unusual for speakers on a panel like this. Let me answer the question that was put. What, if any, role do you see for nuclear energy having in the UK energy landscape, and why? Well, the role I see is diminishing. It will diminish, as was already pointed out. The existing fleet of AGRs, with somewhat elastic timescale, disappears, and eventually the PWR at Sizewell will go 2035 or so, and then if it actually does get built, Hinkley will go a long time after that. That's a diminishing role. The why is really the important question. Why do I see it having a diminishing role? Before I explain that a little bit, I'm sort of really struck by the extraordinary capacity of nuclear power to occupy the minds of politicians. You have a conservative government with very strong free market credentials that, in order to get Hinkley away, has been persuaded it has to buy, through a state purchasing agency, all of our electricity, all of the electricity from Hinkley for the next 35 years at a fixed price that's index linked. So though it was £92.50 when the announcement was first made, it's now £107, something like that, and will go on going up at that rate. Because now you can imagine what it takes to persuade a right-wing conservative government with free market credentials to create a public purchasing agency to buy all of a plant's electricity for 35 years. You've got to wonder what exactly is wrong that markets can't deal with this problem. And that, of course, is part of the why. And the point was made about the 8 or 9, it was both was said, gigawatts of AGRs going out of, and we've got to replace them. Well, that's certainly true. We'll have to replace them at some point with something. They produce about 66 terawatt hours a year of electricity. There's a really simple way of dealing with the uncertainties, and that's to auction as they come off stream, to auction, run an auction to supply that 66 terawatts as and when you need it. And that will resolve who's right and who's wrong about a lot of the economic questions. So if a government really believes in markets, if you really believe in the efficiency and the competitive position of nuclear power, you simply bid into the auction at whatever price you think you can deliver and see what happens. That's my test, and my guess is nuclear won't pass that test, and that's why I think its role will be diminishing. But let me set another couple of points in a bit of context for that. The argument for nuclear, and I completely buy the importance that was stressed of having a low carbon electricity supply. That's going to be really important. That's going to be enormously important in order to maintain prosperity and security across the planet. What's very interestingly unique in terms of public policy about having to deal with climate change is you don't only have to get to the right place, which we have to do with all policies, but you have to get there by a defined time or else your policies failed. And what that means for energy policy is the government recognised in the Climate Act 80% reduction in emissions by 2050. I suspect we're really talking about completely carbon neutral energy system by around 2050 if we're going to have any chance of actually meeting that objective. And so the question is, can nuclear play a really important role in doing that? New nuclear, let me be clear, because the existing nuclear will continue for a somewhat elastic length of time. And the answer to that is basically no, it's too slow and too expensive, because one of your other constraints on what you do is the availability of capital. And given that the market is not going to pay for nuclear power, it's the availability of public capital. And as you may have noticed, there's a bit of stress on public capital at the moment. So the idea that somehow we're going to accelerate the amount that we're going to spend on building nuclear power stations in order to replace the private capital that will and is flowing into renewables and efficiency and batteries and all that seems to me quite implausible. The reality of nuclear power is it's, and really what in a sense is the source of its problem, it's a very complicated technology that's wonderfully enthralling to engineers, but it's actually a dumb technology from the 21st century. And it's trying to compete in an energy system that's increasingly evolving in a digitized world. And it's having to compete against digitization and all the things that, and improvements and efficiency improvements that digital brings for you. And let me explain part of the vulnerability of nuclear as a central part of our overall electricity system. We have, depending on how you count it, somewhere between 60 and 80 gigawatts, some numbers would go much higher, generating capacity available on the grid. So a lot of, and all of that represents an enormous amount of capital that we've tied up. This winter, peak demand for that system for the coldest half hour was about 59 gigawatt or so. Winter before that, it was down around 40 something. More or less between April and October in any normal year, not this year, which will be even lower, but you're never going to get above 30 gigawatt demand. Now what that means is you have an enormous amount of capital tied up in a generating system that's not earning revenue most of its time. If you try to run an airline on a capital utilization factor like that, you'd be bust in a month. You can't do that. So the real challenge for our low carbon electricity system in particular is how to get more capital productivity. And that's really what the NIA and indeed Ofgem and in its most recent report, the National Grid are beginning to point to. We have a system that's really, really inefficient. And where you're going with that system in a digitized world is a system that uses much more distributed generation, much smaller units of generating capacity, much more flexible, huge value, as the NIA has pointed out, in flexibility. And where big lumps of anything, whether it's nuclear or whether it's tidal lagoons, I thought the government was right not to go ahead with tidal lagoons, big lumps of anything reduce your flexibility and therefore make the overall productivity of the system lower, and that makes it harder to meet your low carbon objectives in time. So those are the reasons why I don't think nuclear is going to be able to compete as we go forward into the future. The economics simply won't stand it up in a modern, smart, digital world.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tom. Okay, good. Very interesting. And now we're going to turn over to Paul from EDF, who's going to give us his perspective of the role of nuclear.
Thank you. Thanks. Can you hear me at the back, just to check? Excellent. I'm first of all pleased to be here representing a company that and with the opportunity to look across all of the different technologies that are involved in keeping our lights on today and all of the technologies that are likely to be keeping our lights on as we look out to 2050. And to answer the question in the same way as Tom does, what role do I think nuclear will have? The same, perhaps slightly more. Why do I believe that? The first reason is because I'm convinced that the most important thing we have to do is we have to find a way to decarbonise the electricity system. Because decarbonising the electricity system is a route to decarbonise more of our economy. And that means we need probably more electricity, notwithstanding the improvements that we have to make in energy efficiency, because it'll play a growing role in transport and it'll play a growing role in heat. So we need about the same, maybe a bit more electricity that we have today. We know if it's going to be a low carbon system that fossil fuels without capture and storage can only play a less than 15% role in that system. So about 85% is going to have to come from low carbon technologies. And the natural choices for that are, the big contributors to that are some more onshore wind, some solar, a lot of big offshore wind, and I will argue some nuclear in the mix. And the reason for nuclear is, Tom talked about the amount of energy we need each year, the terawatt hours of energy. The reality is that our demand for energy shifts, not just over the day, but over the seasons. And we have to find technologies, solutions that are sufficiently flexible to make sure that the light switch does go on when we want it to go on. And batteries are a great supplement to solar panels. So the sun predictably comes up and goes down every day, and batteries can therefore store energy that we produce during the day and allow us to use that during the night. But that's not the only challenge that the UK faces in our energy system. We have to think about what happens between the summer and the winter. There's a lot more sun in the summer, and there's a lot less sun in the winter, which is when we need most of our energy. And the wind doesn't blow predictably and steadily throughout the year. We're all in the middle of a period where, to coin the phrase, the mills have gone still. We're seeing a 4-week period where wind is not producing at the level that it produces on average. And what I'd like to do, if I can, is I want to throw a few numbers at you just to illustrate what that means. Because if I take the example of a wind farm that we've built up in the north of Scotland at a place called Doranel, 177 megawatts of wind capacity. On an average windy week, that produces about 9 gigawatt hours a week. On a really windy week, it produces about 25 gigawatt hours. On a really still week, it produces pretty much nothing. So if I say, well, I want to make sure that I've got enough energy stored to fill the gap for a week where it produces less than its average, so I want to store those 9 gigawatt hours, that would take me 400 times the largest battery that's on the UK system at the moment, which is a battery that my company has built at West Burton, a 50 megawatt, 25 megawatt hour battery. That battery at West Burton is some 21 lorry containers full of batteries. So to store a week's energy from our one wind farm at Doranel would take some 8,000 containers worth of batteries to store just 1 week's worth of one wind farm, which is 0.1% of the energy that we need. So we need to find a different solution to flex and to store the energy. The cars and batteries in cars and vehicle to grid will play a role, but certainly none of the modelling that I've seen and none of the modelling about what's a cost-effective system has that problem solved credibly without nuclear playing an important role. If I then just go on to say, okay, so Tom's challenges were the challenge of, can it, the cost effectiveness of the choice. It was a bit disingenuous to only talk about the £92.50 for Hinkley Point C. Hinkley Point C is going to produce 25 terawatt hours a year. The government had signed long-term index-linked contracts for about the same quantity of wind power at an average price of £125 per megawatt hour at the time that Hinkley Point deal was signed. So the future wind projects are coming down in price. Fantastic that the last auction the price was £57.50. Hopefully we'll see further cost improvements as the auctions play out and as technology improves. We will see the same thing for nuclear power. The next project that EDF Energy is looking to progress at Sizewell C, we know that we can take 20% out of the cost of building the project, and if we then use the approaches that Neil talked about in terms of different ways of financing that project at a lower cost of capital, then the costs of a nuclear station will be down well competitive with the costs of wind farms and solar projects. So nuclear will be an affordable part of the mix. All we have to do is show that we can build it successfully. And again, Neil talked about the fact that the design that we're building in Somerset is already working in China. We are going to show here in the UK that we can build it successfully. We are on track 2 years into the project in Somerset at Hinkley Point. That's 2 years into a 10-year construction, so there is still more to go. But at the moment, we are on track to meet the timetable. There are 3,700 people on the site working very effectively, making sure that the UK does what the UK does well, which is engineer to time and to quality. And we've seen that in some of the recent projects, whether that's Crossrail, whether that's the Olympics. The list of projects is starting to grow, and if we believe in ourselves and learn the lessons of previous projects, we will be successful. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, turning now to Malwina, who's here from the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy and can give us that perspective on the role of nuclear in the future.
It's slightly conservative, so apologies for that. Can you hear me? Maybe I can. Right. So in my answer, I would like to come back a little bit to the basics and turn this question around and ponder for a bit on why do we actually need nuclear power? And the answer for the question is, of course, climate change. UK has signed the Climate Change Act in 2008, which is legally obliging us to reduce the carbon emissions by 80% by 2050 in comparison to 1990 levels, which of course is a huge challenge. This means that, just to reiterate, that means that we will have to completely decarbonize the electricity grid. That means that we'll have to decarbonize substantial parts of transport and heating, and a lot of that will go through the electrification, even increasing the impact on the electric system in the UK. So we have to really seriously think about our options. What are the low carbon options that we have? And there's a small number of technologies. So we have nuclear, which already works quite well in the UK. We have offshore wind, onshore wind, solar PVs, biomass, and hydro. Hydro simply doesn't work for the UK. We don't have that resource here. For the solar, it's growing. However, we don't really have good storage techniques, and the solar PV still have very low load factor in quite rainy Britain. So what we are left with are really offshore wind, onshore wind, and nuclear. And I think wind will have a very important role as soon as we will start developing a little bit better storage technologies. But nuclear will still play a very important role in the UK energy system. And that can be reiterated through the governmental support that has been reiterated through various rounds of funding and speeches of the ministers. There are three main pillars of that support. First one is support for the new build projects. As someone already mentioned, DK is planning to build 18 gigawatts of nuclear power plants. That's very much new power. And I was glad to hear an update from Paul about how well the Hinkley Point C is going. We expect to get first electricity from that in 2025. Also, last month, the government has, of course, announced that we have entered negotiations with Horizon Nuclear Plant about the Wilfa site. So this is all very exciting. The next pillar is clean growth strategy. For those that are not familiar with it, it's essentially like a pack of policies and plans of the government that explains how to grow the economy while reducing the carbon emissions. And nuclear plays a really important role in that. For example, finding-wise, there is, I think, £460 million of new funding for nuclear power, out of which I think 180 in my immediate team for nuclear innovation. Additionally, we already spent since 2016 until this year 20 million on the first phase of the nuclear innovation program. And there is £7 million also for upscaling the regulator so they can deal with the advanced reactors to come. And the last pillar is nuclear sector deal, of course, published also a while ago. However, there are some very important notes in it. First one is about the cost reduction. So 30% cost reduction for new build plants by 2030. This is a very substantial reduction. Nuclear is moving slow, so 10 years, I think, is quite a good schedule for that. The next point is about also cost reduction, but for decommissioning. So decommissioning is currently quite expensive, but nuclear sector deal is aiming at reducing costs of decommissioning by 20% by 2030. There's also a substantial amount of contracts that supply chain is hoping to gain from the domestic and international market. I think it is estimated to be around £2 billion. And the last point, and my favorite point personally, is about the share of women in nuclear. So by 2030, nuclear sector deal is promising to have 40% of women in nuclear, which means that potentially if we have this panel in 10 years, there will be more female faces at the table. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Malwina. Okay, good. And Ben has been patiently waiting at the end, so Dr. Ben Britton.
Thank you very much. Patiently waiting and patiently watching many of my talking points being gracefully taken by colleagues. So I am the geeky nuclear engineer, I guess, to finish us off with this. And I guess I'm going to talk about the dumb technology with just a very brief demonstration. This is a nuclear fuel pellet. This little fuel pellet here will power your home for 6 months. And it generates the equivalent electricity as 1 ton of coal. So that dumb technology is enabling us to split the atom every day. It generates power day come night. And we can get lost very quickly in the numbers. We can think about the idea of capacity versus the total amount of energy that's generated. And capacity is this idea that we can switch on our solar panels to generate power at any time. We've got this digital control over the sun. We have it between the hours of 8 in the morning and 6 in the evening. That's our digital control. There's a huge risk to the capacity in the UK that we require us to have low carbon generation, and that low carbon requirement doesn't switch off in 2030. And as we've heard, the demand on creating this significant engineering contraption, this object that's requiring 3,000 people, highly skilled colleagues like myself, that takes 10 years. So if we're looking at a 2030 switch-off schedule, then we should be making decisions now in order to mitigate the consequences for climate change for the next generation and beyond. especially as we move forward and we think of how do we make this work, well, first we need to enact the cost reductions and other opportunities. We need to enable us to sustain the generation of skilled engineers in the sector. Part of that sustaining is actually diversifying, and I too agree that this panel hopefully will increase in diversity, not only on gender, but also on representation of the UK and international society working in this area. But in order for us to progress that and compete with other high-tech jobs, skills and opportunities, and that I teach at this college, I see where my students go, and there are lots of lures elsewhere. And to do this, we must have a sustained investment in creating a low-carbon future through the generation of new build. And at the same time, we can share the benefits of that new build scenario with the opportunities afforded with the next generation of technology. So we can avoid this risk of a jam tomorrow argument, where we hope that things like fast reactors or fusion will deliver us this green utopia. And instead, we can focus on the pragmatic reality of reducing costs, improvement time to build, and improvement in predictability of those engineering challenges through the development of modern building technologies. It's amazing that the majority of nuclear reactors that are currently in play were designed effectively without a modern computer, certainly less good than my mobile phone. So when we think of how we want to operate a nuclear reactor, and especially as we move towards the intermittency of our grid, as afforded effectively because we are encouraged to have a renewable generation, which has this unpredictability in supply, both based upon, say, clouds moving across the sky and changing how the load is coming off a solar farm. It's changing how your family are interacting with their local demand, as well as the difference in goods and services and the just-in-time delivery network that is changing how we are pulling electricity off the UK grid. In turn, we now have on-demand methods to effectively do real-time simulation of operation conditions in the nuclear reactor. So when we set up a nuclear reactor, we can talk about the capacity, current capacity factors. We can operate a nuclear reactor at about 92% capacity. That means if we build a 3.2 gigawatt, we get 92% at maximum capacity of the reactor operating over its lifetime, which is a phenomenally efficient engineering construction. This reactor will effectively take, I think it's about the size of Imperial College in terms of its generation, and it's generating 6% of UK electricity in that building structure. But if we want the intermittency that's afforded by us moving towards a greater proportion of wind and solar, we can also dial that back. So currently in France, EDF France have reactors, there are 4 to 6 of them, I think, that are effectively demanded to have a 20-minute switch down. So in 20 minutes, they can reduce the capacity they're generating to 20% of their load through clever engineering solutions that are afforded by bright people coming through the system and are enabling us to effectively adapt current technology for our future world. So I strongly disagree that this is a dumb technology. I think it is a great opportunity for us to deliver a low-carbon solution, and the sustained investment provides us a sustainable and reliable and long-term solution to the UK's low-carbon future.
Right. Okay, lots of really interesting points raised by the panel. I've heard things about skills, I've heard things about costs, I've heard things about where our capital goes. A lot in a very good way, everyone working towards the same climate change and decarbonisation goals, and with slightly different perspectives of the future. Before we open up to questions, I want to ask everyone a question, and please provide a very short answer. I gave you a little bit more time than promised on each of those other talks. On a slightly different issue, which didn't come up there, and I just want us to raise it before we go out to questions here, which is about public opinion. Nuclear has in the past provoked many different kinds of reactions from members of the public, and I would love to hear from this very experienced panel what role they think the public and public opinion in general has in terms of our sort of transition to a low-carbon energy sector, and particularly the role of nuclear. So I'm going to give you just a very short minute or so to talk about public opinion, and I'm going to go this way down the panel this time. So Ben, over to you.
So when we think of nuclear power, lots of people think The Simpsons, and I guess I've got one that's going to get some irate comments, I believe, in a moment. So we think of nuclear waste. My colleagues work lots on that. This is a waste puck. It's an atomic bottle that's containing nuclear fuel. It doesn't have fuel in it at the moment, but effectively we lock up the nuclear fuel for a significant period of time. Currently we can store waste for 100 to 200 years without problems. So that's many generations. This is if your entire lifetime's energy needs to come from nuclear. And it fits in the palm of my hand. Total amount of waste in the UK by volume is about half the volume of St Paul's. So it is a problem. It lasts 10,000 years or longer. There are risks with respect to it leaching into the environment, but there are colleagues, geography escapes me, but somewhere over there who are working to try and solve those challenges for our future generations. Unfortunately, when we have other technologies, they are much newer to the system, and the long-term legacy of the other things, CO2 for instance, is a huge risk to us. So it's all about the relative understanding of the challenge, and hopefully persuading, I see a few of my students here, to go out and talk to people and persuade them that any way we want to generate electricity has a burden to it. And in order for us to persuade, it's about making an educated and hopefully enlightened choice about what the relative cost of us having fans and lighting in our daily lives.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ben. And Malwina, speaking to us a bit about the role of the public in this.
Right. So I would like to start with some facts. Our department is running those public surveys about what people think about our policies about a quarter. And from the latest one, I can see that 38% of population is actually supporting nuclear power in the UK. So it's really good percentage. Only 22% actually opposes it, which is relatively small, and the rest doesn't really have an opinion. So we don't really know whether they just don't have enough information to make that decision, or they're just not interested. Either way. Either way, what we try to do as a government, we try to make sure that everyone has the information, and if they have strong opinion, they can actually measure it against the facts, which is really important. So one of the tools we have released already a few years ago is 2050 calculator, which actually allows everyone without specific and specialized knowledge about energy policies or technologies themselves to just move some levers and see how this impacts the UK energy policy and how that affects our climate targets for 2050. So it's a really simple tool that allows everyone to essentially be, the government and make the decision that is right. So I would really recommend everyone to take a look. Additionally, I just looked up a simple example of nuclear power. So if you crank up the nuclear power to maximum level that we think we can build, which is approximately how France built their reactors in the 80s, we would reduce our carbon emissions by around 30%. So it's a long way to the 80% mark. However, it's not a golden bullet, so we still have to think about other things. The energy is relatively, well, it's big. However, it's a relatively solvable problem. There are other ones in terms of carbon emissions, which are much bigger, like agriculture. So, yeah. Okay,
great, thanks. Useful to have those figures from your surveys. Over to you, Paul. I'm sure you speak to the public sometimes.
Yes, no, obviously we do a lot of similar polling to the work that Bayes does. Just to add a couple of statistics to those. The first one is when we ask the question about what do you see a role for nuclear as part of the mix. The number moves up from 38 to the mid-60s, and it's been stable at the mid-60s for the best part of the last decade. It dipped when Fukushima happened, but it recovered. Secondly, there's always a prejudice that the communities where nuclear power stations are somehow hoodwinked and really wish that they weren't Springfield. The reality is that the polling around nuclear power stations is more strongly supportive of the stations and of nuclear power playing a role. And when we've asked why that is, what we hear is that they see the benefits that come economically, but what they also see is the lie being given to some of the fears. They see how carefully the people in the station look after the safety and the integrity of the reactors. And in support of that, one of the things that we do, and we have done over the last few years, is we reopened all our visitor centres, and we welcome groups of people from the public to come and have a look around the stations and see for themselves what it's like inside a nuclear power station. And is, you know, one of my things I celebrate is just occasionally we come up on things like the Visit Scotland best places to go if you are looking for something to entertain your family in Scotland. So if you've not been to a nuclear power station, I really do urge you to take advantage of the visitor centres and the opportunity to go and see for real what this technology is. And if you can't do that, go online. There are a whole number of simulations that you can see about what nuclear power is, what the reality is. You can see people talking, and most recently we've developed a visualization of what it's like inside the reactor when the fission reaction is going on to explain what happens. And again, as people get to understand more, what we see is that they're not ignoring the risks, but they are more comfortable that those risks are being managed carefully and responsibly.
Okay, great, thanks. Over to you, Tom. Public opinion, does they have a role?
Well, Malwina didn't quite tell you all of the statistics that are there, which show overwhelmingly, when asked, the public wants to see more renewables. I think 70% plus. So you can pick your evidence where you want to about public opinion. I think what difference it will make? Practically none, one way or the other. And you can see that very clearly in the way governments behave. This government is no different than most governments. This is a government that says it doesn't want more onshore wind because the public is against it, and that if the public doesn't like fracking, we'll just have to put up with it. So I'm not sure that public opinion is playing very much of a role in government decisions on energy policy, whatever the statistics show that the public thinks.
Great, thanks. Neil.
Well, I don't really agree with Tom. I think in the long term, public opinion will actually decide these issues. We live in a democracy at the moment. Renewables are certainly more popular than nuclear, but I think the public, my sense is, the public is quite accepting of nuclear as long as they can see that there is a need for it. It's really as simple as that. In terms of the sort of next few years, probably the critical issue is the attitude around nuclear sites, and I think there isn't significant local opposition on site to where new nuclear stations are being built. In fact, they're generally rather positively welcomed by the local community. The other area where public opinion is particularly important is, of course, nuclear waste management, where the government is looking for volunteer regions that will volunteer for a waste depository, and that, well, I think the consultation is still out, but historically it's been very difficult to get public agreement to that, and ultimately that can be a problem, but it's not a problem for a long time to come because, for instance, Hinkley Point C, the used fuel will be stored quite safely, probably for 100 years on the site. So it's not a very pressing problem, but that is a difficult issue. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you all. Some interesting and, again, varied points. I do have another question up my sleeve here, but I'm going to hold on to it for a while, possibly till the end, so that we don't take up all the time for you in the audience to ask us some questions. So at this point, I'm going to open up to questions in the audience. What I'm going to do is just take a couple at a time. I'd ask that before you ask your question, please state your name and where you come from or where you're associated with, if you have an association. And then I'm going to ask just a couple of speakers here each time to answer it, just to get through as many questions as possible. So I see hands. Okay, we can start from lady there in the aisle there, and then I'll take this gentleman in parallel in front of the aisle. Do we have microphones?
No.
There's a lady straight down there with long black hair. Keep going up.
Hello, my name is Maki Nakagawa. I'm working for Daiwa Research Institute. I've been working with Monju and Tokai and NDF, which is a decommissioning project association in Japan. As you know what happened in Monju, I have a quite a specific question with regard to decommissioning to Dr. Ben. New technology for the new nuclear power plant is very exciting, but do you have any other new technology to help or to be more financially efficient for decommissioning project?
Okay, great. Thank you. And if we can have that other question here at the front.
Rick Parker, visiting professor in mechanical engineering here at Imperial College. I just made 3 brief points, mainly directed, I think, at Tom. Firstly, on UK energy balance, the Energy Technologies Institute, a public-private partnership, has created an ESME model for the UK future energy balance, and that came to the result of economics and greenhouse gas prevention. The right balance was 1/3 nuclear, 1/3 renewables, 1/3 gas with CCS. And that's actually an increase in nuclear. Secondly, Tom's exactly right. The price strike for Hinkley Point was totally ridiculous compared to renewables. Why is that? It's because our solar and wind power friends are literally fair weather friends. They contract at a low price for when the sun's shining and when the wind's blowing, and it's not their problem if that doesn't happen. If they were made to contract for 24 hours of electricity and buy any gap in market prices, you'd see them getting towards the Hinkley price. And the capital price of Hinkley, why is it so high? That's back to Neil's point that infrastructure on that timescale and that amount needs government participation. If the government had underwritten the loans, so they took away some of the financial risk, we'd have saved £1 billion. If the government had run a competition to build not 1 but 4 power stations to the same design, we'd have saved £2 billion. If the government had provided the funding in the first place, we'd have saved a further £1 billion, and that would have brought the strike price below a taxed renewable price.
Okay, thank you. Those questions were also helpfully mostly directed at someone. So if I can ask Ben in the first instance to ask the question about decommissioning technology.
So yes, there are lots of new technologies. So I guess one is we see the increased use of drone technology to reduce human interaction in demanding environments, both of surveying large areas, increased in sensor capabilities, and increased in multimodal data management. So we can combine visual feeds with things like in situ monitoring of radioactive isotopes. We can also build and design reactors now with decommissioning instinctively in the build. And that's specifically driven by the new models, effectively, of how the financing is done, such that decommissioning comes with the initial purchase price. And the other major sort of area is effectively moving beyond the once-through fuel cycle to increase the burn-up of nuclear fuel. And so effectively trying to increase the use of things like mixed oxide fuels, or perhaps also fast burner reactors to increase or decrease the long-term legacy of the high radioactive isotopes in those systems.
Okay, great, thanks. I don't know, Paul, if you had anything to add on decommissioning technology? No. That's sufficient. Okay, great, nice and thorough. And then maybe, Tom, if I can ask you first to speak to the points that were brought up about price strike and so on.
I mean, people have models. There are dozens of models which go from everything from a completely nuclear to a completely nuclear-free. You pick the model you want. By and large, I don't know that there's any or particular authority for any particular model. And by the way, I include the IEA models in that. I think there are all kinds of serious methodological questions being raised about a lot of the modeling, particularly integrated modeling, which tries to integrate engineering models and energy policy models with economic models, where the outcomes are enormously dependent on how you, what assumptions you make and how you weight those assumptions. So by and large, you can pick a model and give you an answer you want. And so I don't think it helps us to quote models in this. On the strike prices, yeah, you have to look at what the whole system cost is. And by the way, you have to apply the same discount rate, otherwise you're getting a misleading thing. And when you do that, I'm not sure the figures come out quite as favorably as you suggest they do there. And there's a downside about doing something that takes you a long time and you only do a small number of. particularly in an era when we've got massive engineering and technological innovation, which is you have a very slow rate of learn to develop and drive your technology and innovation forward. If you do as you do with the whole renewables suite, not the technology, the batteries, the whole suite, you do lots and lots and lots of small things, so you have a very much faster rate of engineering and technology learning, which gives you many and wider and wider options. So there's a real drag on innovation that comes from doing large-scale things that take you 10 years to build.
Okay, great, thank you. And then just building on from that, I wondered, first of all, maybe Paul, would you be willing to speak to the cost price reductions you were referring to of your nuclear build, which may speak to some things Tom just raised?
Yeah, I mean, Neil started to talk about some of the things, but I mean, Rick, you know, I'm not sure I completely agree with some of your points about what could have made Hinkley Point C cheaper. You know, factually, first of all, when the deal was approved by the European Union, it did include Treasury guarantees on the debt in the project. So there were loan guarantees there associated with the package. We actually decided not to use those, and so then, you know, they have been cancelled. But it's a bit unfair to say that there was something there that could have reduced the strike price, and the reason we chose, you know, it's, but I think, you know, more to the point, you know, why do I believe future projects can be cheaper? Part of it is that a big chunk of the cost of doing a first nuclear project, particularly a first project here in the UK, is the cost of making sure that you have been through the design acceptance and the equipment qualification of each of the pieces of equipment that are needed to build a nuclear power station. And it's a matter of public record that we had spent well over £2 billion before a final investment decision was taken on Hinkley. And certainly I hear similar numbers being talked about the amount that Hitachi and the team working on Horizon have invested already. If you do a second project, there's a large piece of that you can avoid. We are looking to copy-paste the vast majority of the design from Hinkley for our project at Sizewell C. The second thing, and that will reduce upfront costs, it'll reduce qualification costs. The second thing is that people can look at the track record of what's being delivered, and for Hinkley Point, it was a design that wasn't running anywhere else in the world at the point where the investment decision was taken. I mean, Tom and his friends, I mean, he and I discussed that a number of times, I think. We're going to be looking at a future project where there is a project running and people can look and be reassured that the technology works, and the government, the National Audit Office, have been given the advice of saying think about different ways of getting the risk allocation and the risk allocation right, because for this first project we are being paid to take all of the construction risk, and we're being paid to take some elements of operating and political risk associated with the deliverability of the project and its operation over time. And to do that, we and our Chinese partners needed an acceptable rate of return. If we can reduce that rate of return that is needed towards utility rates of return, not even towards government rates of return, but the rates for infrastructure, then there's a massive saving on the cost of nuclear projects.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, a couple more questions then. Okay, since you're at the back, Neil, the lady just there, and then this gentleman over here. Yeah.
Thanks. Mira Shah from the Centre for Environmental Policy over at Imperial College. it talks about a low carbon world, so just trying to get you out of the UK context, wondering where you think nuclear fits in a developing country context. Particularly interested in what you think about doing nuclear in Africa.
Okay, great. And over here.
Okay. Jeff Haywood, member of the public and an EDF customer. Now, as a customer, I just wonder what will happen to the supply of nuclear energy from France once we leave the EU. But that's not my main question. My main question is on renewables. Now, you've spoken about solar energy and wind farms and how unpredictable and inefficient they are. But the most predictable and efficient form is tidal power. Now, a few weeks ago, they abandoned the scheme to use tidal power in Swansea Bay, and no reason was given. What does the panel think about tidal power, and why is it being handicapped by government decisions?
Okay, great. Thank you. Interesting questions. Neil, I'm going to start by turning to you. Neil's done extensive work on the international energy side to tell us a little bit about where you see the role of nuclear more globally and perhaps particularly in Africa.
I don't think that Africa is going to be the main theatre for nuclear development in the short term. That's not where most of the activity is going on. In the longer term, who knows? But certainly in India, most of the nuclear power stations under construction today, of which there are many around the world, are in China and India. And these countries are also investing heavily in nuclear research. And of course, these are the parts of the world where electricity demand is growing most rapidly. So I do think if you look on a global basis, these are the areas where nuclear power will be developing. And I think there's every prospect at the moment of nuclear having a bright future in those parts of the world. But like everywhere else, it will compete ultimately with renewables plus storage and various other options for flexibility. India, very committed to solar energy for obvious reasons. China is a huge investor in renewables. So slightly similar to the UK, I think we'll see another big round of nuclear construction in these countries. A lot of research. A longer term prospect depends on the competitive situation against renewables with various forms of flexibility.
Okay, great. And then, I don't know, Malwina, are you willing to say something about tidal power and perhaps something about Brexit and nuclear electricity? As government representative?
I'll skip the Brexit, but I do have something to say about the tidal power. We do evaluate every proposal that comes to government for value for money and other additional value. So unfortunately, that tidal lagoon project was just not good value for money. Additionally, we didn't really see the value, well, not the value, but we didn't see the possible cost reductions. So it is expensive now, and we suspect it will be expensive in the future, whereas in case, for example, wind and solar, we had a bit better idea thinking that probably these would come down in the future.
Okay, thanks. Good afternoon.
Thank you.
Full dialogue. Chat a little bit over wine shortly. There'll be the opportunity to speak further. I'll come to you in a second. Paul, I wanted you to have a chance to engage with your customer very briefly.
Yeah. Firstly, delighted to hear that you're a customer. Secondly, I just want to reassure you that I'm not expecting that when we leave the European Union that the electrons will stop flowing or the molecules will stop flowing. Interestingly, a number of people have talked about the National Infrastructure Commission report, which one of the less reported aspect of that is that there is a lot of assumptions about the volume of interconnection that we will have in future. Up to 30% of the UK need is expected in that report to be supplied from overseas somewhere. And one of the things I think we have to challenge ourselves and challenge the NIC a little bit on is to make sure that that is low carbon as well, and we are not just offshoring our carbon production somewhere else in the world. And my fear would be, unless Germany finds a way to wean itself off lignite, that we're substituting low carbon UK production for higher carbon continental production and offshoring jobs in the process.
Okay, thanks, Paul. And Tom, I know you mentioned the tidal lagoon a little bit earlier, and perhaps you might also comment on the international question too.
Well, tidal lagoon, I mean, I thought the government made the right decision on the tidal lagoon, and I don't think government, I don't often find myself doing that on energy policy. But one of the reasons was the one that Malwina makes, that there is very little prospect for cost reduction as technology evolves. That would be true, as Paul was mentioning, for nuclear if we hadn't decided in our wisdom to go ahead with 4 different types of reactor, which is repeating a mistake we made with the AGR program back in the 70s. It's hard to do that, get those cost reductions, if you build different kinds of reactors, which is what we're about to do. The real problem with all of this is where electricity policy in particular is going. The central questions are not what technology do you choose to generate electricity, but how are you going to construct the architecture of your electricity system? And most of our policy discussion doesn't touch that issue at all. So we're well behind where the thinking is on the future of electricity generation in most of this discussion. I think what's going to Africa, you asked about in particular, I think Africa is going to do on renewables exactly what it did on telephones and completely leapfrog the building of large grids and integrated systems, partly because of the capital constraints. It's actually easier to do something particularly fast if you're going to do it with lots and lots of small amounts of capital than if you're trying to assemble big amounts of capital and deploy them in high-risk projects.
Okay, great, thanks. Interesting answers there. Opportunity for more questions. Hands up. Okay, moving further into the rows there. Man there with the check t-shirt. And over here in the white shirt just behind you, Abby.
Hi, so I'm Duncan Reist in the Sustainable Energy Future Masters here at Imperial. So I just wanted to get a bit of an opinion on, so you said the UK government's putting forward the competition about SMRs. I was thinking, get your opinion on essentially the future in, what's happening with SMRs, and do you feel it has a future? And maybe looking further forward and talking a bit about Gen 4 and if anything can happen there. And I know it's difficult to put a timescale on anything in nuclear because it always changes, but if you can, try.
Okay, great, thanks. And over here?
All right, Zach Johnson, Imperial College graduate student for nuclear engineering. My question is, how can the role of nuclear energy be continued to be important in a low-carbon future for the UK, given that they have suspended reprocessing, that there's approximately 100 to 150 years left of uranium supply for the planet, and Generation 4 technologies are not necessarily new. They're about ideas that are 40 years old.
Okay, great. Some good challenges there. I hear quite a bit of technical questions, so I'm going to start off by turning over to SMRs and some of those comments about the challenge of uranium supply and reprocessing suspension.
So for those of you who don't know what an SMR, small modular reactor, formally it's less than 300 gigawatt electrical, so Hinkley Point C is 3.2 gigawatts, just to give you, it's a scale factor of 10 down in size. The benefit there is effectively you get to build smaller objects, and if you go to a slightly larger object, it's been costed that the development program is about the same price as a jet engine. And so that changes the economics, and specifically on the innovation aspect, effectively if you can reduce the size of the object, you can effectively increase the throughput and time to design, to manufacture, to build, to operate, to improve. And importantly also you have the opportunity to export to markets that we don't access currently. So when we talk about going to Africa, if we can have an SMR program, there's an opportunity for us to access smaller, more distributed grids and to support their low carbon futures there. In terms of Generation 4 and the designs there that are a while ago, yes and no, they're old and new. Some of the Generation 4 reactor designs are being currently built. There is a very high temperature reactor in China, for instance, a demonstration reactor. A very high temperature reactor enables you to operate at 800 degrees plus. C, most reactors are operating at 350. Importantly for that is that we therefore can move decarbonisation beyond electricity, and now we can start generating hydrogen, which enables us to decarbonise things like chemical production, as well as storage of electricity for alternative times of day and night, so time-shifting electricity production. So Generation 4 has an opportunity to open up new things and also reduce some of the risks in terms of build-out and other operational issues. Importantly, though, it is still a significant way away from an engineering prospect, and so we can't lock the door on new build if we also want to get next generation going as well.
Okay, great, thanks. And I don't know, Malwina, if you wanted to say anything about future technologies.
Yes. So we had a while ago an SMR competition, which I think was named unfortunately because it was essentially an information gathering exercise. So the government just needed to know a little bit more about these technologies. And after we finished, we found that actually maybe the bigger value for the UK is in the advanced technologies. So coincidentally, today we're actually kicking off the Advanced Modular Reactor Program in Birmingham, which aims at basically expanding use of energy from, well, nuclear energy from only electricity to other applications, like using heat for domestic heating or for industrial purposes, producing hydrogen, burning waste, as well as load following. So we basically designed a program that goes into phases. We have invited bids, and we got 20 bids for the first phase of the competition, which essentially is feasibility studies. These are feasibility studies that will just allow us to learn a bit more information about each of these technologies, their potential for commercialization in the UK, and what kind of benefits they could have, as well as what kind of research would need to be done to bring them to market. And then subject to decisions, we could potentially fund some of this R&D in the phase 2. So starting from today, we'll have results in about 6 months from the first phase.
Okay, great. Thanks, Malwina. And there was a question there about how long we've got uranium for to provide us with all this nuclear power. I'm going to turn to Tom first and then to Paul.
Yeah, I've spent 20 years working for Rio Tinto, which I think is one of the world's largest suppliers of uranium, and I would treat with extraordinary skepticism any notion of how much uranium is available. It enormously depends on the price. There's been no serious effort to explore for uranium in any mining company anywhere for really quite a long time, because there's been no real prospect of a major increase in demand.
Great, and maybe you also want to speak both uranium and the technology.
I mean, just firstly to echo Tom's view, as a customer of Rio Tinto and others who are finding the uranium, we have to assure ourselves that there's enough of it there to keep our stations running. And you know, our conclusion is that in a world where we needed it, there are plenty of places to find it, not least from seawater if we need to look in, you know, for much larger quantities than are needed at the moment. So I've got no concerns that we will find enough uranium to power the stations that we need to build. And you know, as an industrial player, I'm lucky enough to be responsible for research and development that EDF does here in the UK, thinking about small modular reactors, thinking about advanced technologies, and that is still research work, but you know, we are looking to see whether some of the the skills that we've developed today, not least some of the skills in managing gas-cooled reactors and dealing with higher temperatures, are applicable into Generation 4. And the challenge of, you know, are there no new ideas? I think new applications of ideas and novel use of technology and digital technologies is all part of what will mean that Gen 4 is is an exciting and worthwhile area.
Okay, great. Thank you all. We've got time for a few more questions, so any more eager hands? Yeah. I've got one here at the front, and then back in the back. Gentleman over there. Thanks.
Hi, Richard Pearson, PhD student at the Open University, and I'm also part of the ICO Centre for Doctoral Training, which is based out of here at Imperial College London. I do a lot of speaking in schools and to members of the public, communicating nuclear. I just wanted to get the opinions of the panel on what is needed, because I actually think part of the reason some of those poll numbers you were talking about earlier is because people quite literally look at it as renewables are great, few downsides, they know the sun doesn't shine, the wind doesn't blow, and they look at nuclear and they don't hear the good things. I have a lot of younger siblings and cousins who I speak to, and I ask them what's on the curriculum, and they say this. It's very much like that. I think a lot more can be done in communication on what nuclear power really is and how it can be good, and also some of the downsides as well, such as the financing model you specified. And I just wanted to finish on another point as well, which is the safety aspect. Mike and I had a discussion earlier about this. We overplug safety far too much, especially all the new companies that are coming onto the block as well. We're safer, we're even more safe. It's like, well, hang on, those ones weren't safe. That's how the public rationalise, and that's absolutely fine to do as well. So I just wanted to...
Okay, great, thank you. And up there.
Thank you, Gary Owen, independent consultant. On the subject of finance, I often wonder, why isn't there the equivalent of some sort of infrastructure bond? If there is public appetite for nuclear energy, why not ask the public for investment, which could be perhaps marginally better than the poor rates available in building societies and banks, etc.? Thank you.
Okay, great. Some quite varied questions there. Maybe we can, first of all, look at the communications around nuclear power. I'm going to start with Ben, because I think you do get out there and talk about nuclear power sometimes. Yourself?
So first off, things about communications, well, you're all here. And so one of the things about communications is that we produced a briefing paper. So part of that is, but the counterpoint to this is many of you are energy interested. And specifically, actually, in order to persuade public opinion, most people don't care about how the electrons get their energy when you switch the light switch on. So making people intelligent consumers, opening up some of the more direct dialogues with respect to this. There's a fantastic website, Electricity Map. You can get real-time information about what the CO2 burden is for different generation. And we do at the festival, we produce, effectively, I get my mobile phone out, I tap in Electricity Map and I show it to them. And they go, wow, that's what we're doing, this is what Germany's doing, this is what Sweden's doing. We can have conversations that are dynamic, interactive, engaging, and also they're easy for us to scale out to enable our PhD students, master students, friends, colleagues, neighbours, anyone who will listen to me talk about this every day and every night. But the importantly is trying to come up with engaging dialogues, trying to say, actually, we need to make some conscious choices, and also breaking out of the usual spaces where we do this talking. So actually, talking about what we do with our electricity in the pub with your family is maybe, you might be sort of thinking it's a bit boring, but actually it's an important decision if we think about our future.
Okay, great, thanks. And I'm going to now turn to you, Paul. I presume that you do some of that. Communications about nuclear?
Yes, and I guess I should probably start with an apology, because I'm responsible for the communications for the largest producer of nuclear electricity here in the UK, and clearly I and my team aren't doing our job properly. But I mean, trying to make information available is a first step. The second thing that's blindingly obvious to me is it can't be people like me going out and talking about nuclear power. It needs to be people like the audience. And so, I mean, we have a lot of STEM ambassadors who go out, talk at schools, at science fairs, talk about what they're doing. All of our apprentices, and I'm pleased to say that this year 35% of our apprentices are female. As part of what they do during their apprentice program is they learn to go out and talk publicly, and then they go out and talk publicly about their jobs, about nuclear power, and about what it takes. And we need to keep doing more and more of that. I do agree that there have been times when the industry has been embarrassed to tell people out there what we do, and we need to be braver doing that. I've I've had years of debate about this question of, do we talk too much about safety? Some of that is because we need to remind ourselves that safety is important, and we can't forget that ourselves, and sometimes that translates out into how we talk publicly. But it's a long-term debate about, do you improve or reduce public trust as you talk about something? I haven't got an answer one way or the other on that.
Okay, great. Tom, did you want to say anything about how communications looks?
Don't start from here. It's a bad place to start from. I mean, good luck.
Neil, I wondered if you could speak to this idea of some kind of infrastructure bond as a possible model of finance.
Well, it's not so very different from sort of the ideas that the government is obviously knocking about right now. For instance, the proposal is that the Wilfer government has said that, I think I've got this right, that it's considering coming up with 2/3 of the finance for Wilfer, partly through actual government loans, but also through loan guarantees. So, then have a look at how the bond is structured. Is it issued by the government? Is it guaranteed by the government? Who is ultimately going to repay it? So I think there are a range of options there. But I do think that this question of how the stations are financed and whether you can produce structures where you get interest rates which are closer to utility rates, as Paul was saying, or even to government rates, is absolutely critical. And for instance, the Public Accounts Committee in their analysis said if you could finance closer to government rates, the cost would come down to such an extent that you actually wouldn't need to guarantee a price that was significantly above the competitive price of power today. So I agree, it's a crucial question, and structuring of bonds, government guarantees, government finance, it's quite central. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm just going to go down this way. I think Tom wanted to come in on the cost model.
Look, there are two kinds of economic risk for a nuclear power station. One, can they build it on time and to budget? Construction risk. And that can be covered by, it is proposed to be coming by loan guarantees, provided you can get somebody to loan you the money. If you have a loan guarantee, then whoever's loaned you the money can be sure that even if it all goes wrong, you'll get your money back. But the second risk is much more important, and by the way, not talked about very much, and that's the commercial risk. Once you've built it on time and budget, can you actually sell the product? Well, that's a bit difficult, and the government on Wilfer, for instance, has talked a lot about innovative ways of trying to do something about the construction risk, but is very silent on the question of what it's going to do on the commercial risk. Now, what it's done for Hinkley is essentially relieve Hinkley of all the commercial risk, because it's bought all the electricity for 35 years at twice the current wholesale price. It's also said, by the way, it's not going to do that anymore because there are going to be no increases in levies for low carbon electricity. So it still has to explain to Hitachi how exactly it's going to deal with the commercial risk, because if you're not willing to take the commercial risk, then you won't take the construction risk.
Great, thanks. I think you want to say something, Paul, also about infrastructure bonds.
I mean, just to say, it's as a UK citizen, it's long been a mystery to me why I hear so much about Canadian or Australian pension funds investing in UK infrastructure, and that's not a nuclear point. That's a point more generally, and as we've been exploring the idea of a regulated asset base as an opportunity for our project at Sizewell, we've started talking to pensions funds and to infrastructure investors. And would it go as far as a public bond? I don't know, but it's certainly, there is interest of walking along that route towards finding a way to have UK citizens able to put their money and get the return from the building of UK infrastructure, which seems to me a good long-term thing and a way of financing what we need to do as a country.
Okay, great. And Malwina, did you want to say anything about innovative financing structures? You're good? All covered? Okay, great. So we're at time now, so apologies to those of you who had a question. I didn't pick you, but we are going to head out to the concourse now, which is just outside, to have some drinks, and all of the speakers will be there for the next just under half an hour, so you can go and ask them directly. I would like you to join me in thanking Neil, Tom, Paul, Malwina, and Ben for excellent contributions. And yeah, we hope you find the paper interesting. The drinks and some slight refreshments will be served at our concourse, which I understand is on this level. If you go out that door, then a couple of my colleagues will be there to point you in the right direction.